What is the role of the Old Testament and the law in the life of a believer today? Hey, my name's David Rubelid. We're going to talk about that today in this video. In the last couple years, a famous pastor made a controversial statement saying that the apostles unhitched their faith from the Old Testament, and he said we need to do the same. The passage that was used for this sermon was Acts 15, where the Christians, the believers from a Jewish background, are hearing that people from a non-Jewish background called the Gentiles are coming to faith in Jesus. And some people called the Judaizers are beginning to teach the Gentiles, hey, you now need to be circumcised for the sake of right standing before God. And so they pull together what's called the Council of Jeruselm in Acts 15, and they draft up a letter after going through all the Old Testament law. And in this letter, it's actually pretty simple. And they ask just a few simple things. They say this, they say, stay away from meat that's sacrificed to idols. Stay away from blood and drinking blood. Don't eat meat that was from animals that were strangled, and stay away from sexual immorality. And one of the things that I find fascinating even about this letter is it's not very legalistic. It doesn't say you must stay away from these things, or you should stay away from these things, or you have to stay away from these things. It says, it's pretty simple and kind of not very rigid. It says, hey, you would do good to stay away from these things. And so in the sermon, it made it feel or made it sound that after Jesus, something new had been started. And in a sense, we could throw out all the old and walk into the new. And my question is this true? I mean, did the apostles unhitch their faith from the Old Testament? And are we as believers called to do the same? There are a few ideas or a few, I would say, mantras that I want us to really land on today. The first one, I want us to understand that the law's intention or power is never to make someone righteous. It never was and never will be. It's so easy for us to feel that, man, if I just do everything right, if I just follow the law perfectly, then me and God we're good. But God knew ever since He gave the law to the Israelites in the Old Testament that they weren't going to follow it and we weren't going to follow it. And that's why, by His grace, He offered atonement. And so we now know that we're not going to get it right. We're not going to get it perfect, but God doesn't see our righteousness by if we get the law and our obedience right. He sees our righteousness as Christ's righteousness. And so the purpose of the law and the power of the law is never, ever to make somebody righteous or put them in right standing before God. The second mantra I want us to land on today is that if we are people of faith, if we are people who follow Jesus, we can't just cut ourselves off from the Israel story, because Israel's story, hear this, is a part of our story. What God did through Israel is important leading up to what He did through Jesus and continues to do with us. The promises God made even to Abraham are played out as we, as followers of Jesus, are the continuation of that. I want to bring you into one passage real quick. This is Galatians. And in Galatians 3, Paul is writing. And you could put Galatians actually in the same time period as the Council of Jerusalem. And here's what Paul says. Paul says this. So this is Galatians 3, starting in verse 6. Consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham's faith and his belief in God is actually what made him righteous, not the observance of the law. And you see the same sort of conversation Paul states in Romans 4. And as we continue on, he says this, understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. So we're children of Abraham. We're his descendants now when we believe. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles, not by the law, it says, by faith, and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. So the gospel was announced to Abraham all the way back in the Old Testament. And here in Galatians, he recites Genesis 12. He says this, all nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. And as it continues on, it says, those of us who have faith, we are children, we are seeds of Abraham. So if we are now, by our faith, descendants of Abraham, and we are now sitting along with Abraham, we cannot cut off and unhitch from the Old Testament, because the Old Testament stories of faith and what God did through Israel are a part of our story. Lastly, when we look at the law, Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 17, you may have heard this. He says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. I love what one version says. He actually says, I came to accomplish their purposes. And so if we want to understand what it looks like, we look at Jesus, who accomplished its purposes perfectly. And in Matthew 22, somebody came to Jesus and said, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And he says the second commandment, the second greatest commandment is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then when he's talking about all the law, this is the next statement. He says, all of the law and the prophets hang on these. And so all of the law, the commandments, all the things that we're called to, so to speak, in that sermon from that pastor, unhitch, they're actually hung on loving God and loving one another. Let's look back at Acts 15. The Jewish Christians still held to Jewish customs, Jewish ideas. They wouldn't eat meat that was sacrificed to idols. What I find fascinating in Galatians, when Paul is writing, we see this depiction of both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians are together in one room, but they're not intermingling with one another. And I believe that the call to not eat meat sacrificed to idols, the call to not drink blood, and to stay away from blood and not eat meat from animals that were strangled, I believe that what the Jewish Christians are saying is, hey, would you please do this so that you can love us and allow us to be in the same room, fellowshipping together without any obstacles or trip up with one another. You see, that is a part of the foundation of the law that the law and the prophets are hung on. So again, remember that the purpose of the law is never, ever, and nor will it ever give you power to be righteous before God or be in right standing before God. And that the Old Testament accounts with Israel and God with Israel are the backstory, a part of our story that is continued on through the life of the believers in the church, and we cannot unhitch from that. Hey, thanks again for checking out this video. If you would, hit the subscribe button. You could get notifications for more videos like this. There's more coming your way.